For the last 20 years, basically every company that tried to compete with the UFC has suffered the same fate. Pride disappeared, Strikeforce got bought, Bellator spent years trying to compete with them, and eventually got bought by the PFL. Somehow, the PFL bought Bellator and became less relevant, but now something genuinely interesting is happening. Jake Paul's most valuable promotion has just merged with the PFL, and by next year, the PFL name is basically disappearing. It's all becoming MVP, and for the first time in years, the UFC might actually have a competitor, which is something they have never tried. The question is though, can they actually compete? We've heard it before, PFL has spent years telling everyone that they're going to compete with the UFC, and I mean, to be fair, they had the money. They also signed Francis Ngannou, but he just kind of took the money and never showed up. They bought Bellator and they ended up with hundreds of fighters and some genuinely world-class talent. It sounded pretty good, but the problem is that no one fucking watches it. And that's obviously a slight exaggeration, but it has always been a big issue with the PFL. They could have a great fighter on the card, but 99% of the time, I mean, no one has a clue who the fighter is. The company itself has even admitted that building the brand is very difficult. And when they bought Bellator, I genuinely thought it could change things. Instead, fighters complained about inactivity, the stars left, and the whole thing was just like a complete shit show. So PFL's biggest problem wasn't necessarily finding good fighters, it was getting people to actually care about them. And that's exactly why this merger just makes sense. Because you can say whatever you want about Jake Paul, I mean, the guy knows how to get attention, but Most Valuable Promotion has done something the PFL has struggled to do for years, which was to make combat sports feel like an actual event. Jake Paul fighting Mike Tyson was enormous. Probably the most shittiest matchup we've ever had. MVP has built Amanda Serrano into one of the biggest names in women's boxing. When MVP entered MMA, they didn't quietly put on some card that nobody knew existed. They put on Mike Perry versus Nate Diaz on Netflix. That's the complete opposite of the PFL strategy. The PFL had the roster and the MMA experience, but what they didn't have was the ability to make casual fans care. MVP has shown that promotion is probably the thing they're best at, so putting the two together actually makes a surprising amount of sense. And this isn't just Jake working with the PFL now. I mean, the entire company is changing. PFL and MVP are becoming one combined combat sports company, operating under the MVP name. PFL's current CEO, John Martin, became the CEO of the combined company. Jake and Nikisa Bidarian also remained heavily involved at the board level. And the goal is much bigger than simply running another MMA promotion. They want boxing, MMA, major crossover events. And they want to build fighters into individual stars instead of relying entirely on the promotion's name, which is a pretty obvious shot at the UFC model. And Jake hasn't exactly been subtle about who he's coming after.
Dana White!
He spent years arguing with Dana White about fighter pay. Now, he might just be our only hope. Now, does this mean Dana White is currently hiding underneath his desk? I don't think so. The UFC is still huge compared to these guys. The UFC has the brand, the history, the stars. I mean, they pretty much have everything. And most importantly, the UFC has reached the point where, to casual fans, UFC basically means MMA. Ask some random person what PFL is, and they're not going to know what it is, let's be honest guys. But MVP doesn't actually need to become bigger than the UFC for this to matter. They just need to become big enough that the fighters have another legitimate option. Because that's where the competition becomes interesting. Imagine you're one of the best prospects in the world. The UFC wants you, but MVP MMA also wants you. Now there's two companies instead of just one. Or imagine if you're already a UFC star and your contract ends. Suddenly walking away doesn't necessarily mean disappearing into a promotion nobody watches. If MVP can create a legitimate alternative, the fighters gain leverage. And that's something the UFC hasn't had to worry about consistently for years. And this is where the whole thing either becomes genuinely dangerous or completely falls apart. Because fighter leverage only matters if MVP can build fighters people actually care about. And to be fair, MVP has already shown that they can get people through the door. Their first MMA event on Netflix reportedly averaged over 12 million live viewers globally. I mean, it's fucking enormous. But the Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano was basically a freak show event. It proved MVP can promote one massive night, but it doesn't prove that they can build the entire promotion. The real test is what happens after the famous names are gone. Can they somehow find an 18-0 killer, keep him active, give him some personality, and make him global before the UFC signs him? Because if they can, the UFC isn't just competing with MVP for famous veterans anymore. They're competing with the next generation, and that's when this becomes very dangerous. But merging with the MVP doesn't magically erase all of PFL's old problems. They already have relationships with Netflix, ESPN, Sky Sports, and a ridiculous number of international broadcasters. And having nearly 400 fighters doesn't mean much when some of them spend their entire year waiting to fight. Most importantly, they need matchups that people care about. Jake Paul can get millions of eyes on a promotion, but he can't make people care about two random fighters if they've never heard of them. And if MVP MMA becomes a place where aging UFC fighters go for a final paycheck, then obviously this isn't a new competitor. It's just a PFL with a different logo. So does the UFC finally have a real competitor? Maybe. And honestly, it's about time they do get some competition. MVP now has the fighters, money, and distribution, with Jake Paul's promotion machine attached to it. And not overtaking the UFC anytime soon, they might never do it, but if they can give the fighters a legit second option and force the UFC to compete for talent, that's already a massive win for MMA. The next year will tell us whether this merger is going to change everything or whether the PFL just changed its name and hoped nobody noticed. If Jake Paul somehow ends up being the guy who finally gives the UFC legitimate competition, we are living in the most stupid timeline possible.